what is the legal tender status of the dollar right now? Is it legal tender as set by the federal government, or is it legal tender that, or do states have the option to create legal tender at the moment? Explain that whole piece.
Right. So yes, the U.S. dollar is now official legal tender, and it's what it says on all of your banknotes, your bills. The states, if you go to Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, it has a list of. I also have it printed here, so it's a little bit more.
Oh, fantastic!
There you go. There's a list of prohibitions on things the states can't do.
No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters or mark and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts.
Exactly.
That's the important bit.
That's the important bit.
Okay, explain that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is going back to the founders really wanted to prevent paper money, and states were the chief offenders when it came to paper money. So they wanted to stop. They wanted to prevent the states from having any power to essentially engage in an inflationary monetary policy, and to do that, they passed this. They put this provision into the Constitution that says you can't make anything, which is very broad, but silver and gold coin a tender in payments.
But that's for the states.
For the states.
That's why we don't have a New York dollar or a California dollar.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And you can understand why. That would be beneficial to have a uniform, economy.
Of course.
Right. But the states were always allowed to have gold and silver, as tender, and going back to California, that's what people used.
So
for a long time.
Is gold and silver legal tender in every state now?
Not every state,
but it is in some.
I think Wyoming, it is. It might still be in California, but I'm pretty sure Wyoming it is.
So in Wyoming, if you want to, you can use gold coin to pay for things.
I think so.
And what additional status does that grant that coin as money, being legal tender?
Right. And this is where I think a lot of Bitcoiners get confused. Legal tender is actually a really kind of simple concept. It does not confer tax exempt status on transactions used with that money, which is a common misconception. All it is it's money that must be accepted by a creditor in discharge of a debt.
Okay, so it must be accepted.
Yes.
So therefore in Wyoming, you must accept it.
Right.
And when you say in discharge of a debt...
Pre-existing debt.
Pre-existing debt.
That is to distinguish it from spot transactions, like I'm going to go
into
down
a
to
gas station.
Yeah, the Ventanita to get, our Cuban coffee.
Right.
That would be a spot transaction where it does not have to be accepted.
Give me an example of a debt settlement where it has to be accepted.
Paying your mortgage.
Okay, right? So if I get a mortgage with, I don't know, Chase in Wyoming, they have to, if I want to pay that mortgage in gold, they have to accept it.
Yeah.
That's fucking cool.
I think don't, again, I'm not an expert on Wyoming's laws, but I think I saw that Wyoming is like one of the only states that actually, has a provision for gold as legal tender.
I might call up Tyler Lindholm and say,
that's exactly who you should talk to, actually.
He'd
be the expert.
Are you paying your mortgage in gold coin, Tyler? Let me know.
Because that's what in El Salvador with Bitcoin now is legal tender. That was, some of the trepidation and anxiety from the financial sectors, like, oh crap, how do we now accept this crazy internet money, for people who want to pay their mortgages and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's all. That's what legal tender is. It's not, and then going back to El Salvador, staying on that, you've got kind of this forced tender concept, right? Where even in spot transactions, someone has to accept it.
Yeah. So that's a different scenario.
That's a different scenario. And those did exist in the colonies, and were enforced. And that was also part of the reason the founders didn't like legal tender laws, is, the compulsory aspects of them. But for the most part, when we talk about a legal tender law, we just mean, satisfies the discharge of a debt.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you start thinking about Bitcoin, and you've referred, and earlier in the interview you said these when the Constitution was established, that obviously technology and things change over
Right.
time. So there's a chance you could interpret this that, as it says here, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. I think you potentially making the argument that if Bitcoin had existed, it may have been considered here as something that could be.
Right. Yes. That's the argument I made. I wrote a series of articles for my newsletter going through, basically what happened was there's this huge push for, Bitcoin to be adopted as legal tender, right? And everybody's clamoring for that. And even at the state level here in the States, and nobody's talking about Article 1, Section 10. Like, not even opponents are really raising it. So I was like, why are we just ignoring this purposefully? Like, what? Let's address this. So nobody had made any arguments one way or the other. So I said, well, I'll just make all the arguments. Okay. So I made an argument based on an originalist interpretation of this section, that Bitcoin should be considered essentially a gold or silver coin, that the founders would have approved of Bitcoin based on its similarities with those commodity monies.
In that there's no central party that controls it. There's a scarce aspect.
Scarcity, unforgeably costly.
Yeah.
All those aspects of Bitcoin that we prize were apparent in gold and silver, and obviously Bitcoin elevates that, right, with a global monetary network. I also made the counter argument, the strict textualist counter argument, that this is a very specific clause. You shall not make anything. That's a very broad term, anything but gold and silver coin. And that's a specific term. So you've got a prohibition that's very broad, can't make anything legal tender. And that would then, if you apply that to new technologies, right, because it's a broad term, broad original understanding, that would eliminate Bitcoin because it doesn't fall under the exception, which is very specific, of a silver or gold coin. I presented that counter argument as well. And then I have kind of a follow-up policy argument that I don't think that this is good policy, even if it is constitutional, to adopt Bitcoin as state legal tender. And so we can walk through all those if you want.
Yeah, please do.
So the argument for how Bitcoin could be considered, legal tender under this clause is going back to what we were talking about with the founders and their intent of, eliminating inflationary monetary policies based on their experience, the colonial experience, and the debates and their writings after the debates and during the debates. We know that, they basically had three objectives by limiting the states to gold and silver coin. They wanted to eliminate that inflationary monetary policy. They wanted to stop currency and trade wars amongst the states, because what some states were doing, like Rhode Island, was they were printing a ton of money, and then Massachusetts had to accept it, and they were spending it in Massachusetts before the prices would rise, right? So then they were exporting their inflation to the other states, and then there was tit for tat after that. It was like a state-level Cantillon effect.
That's
right?
like the Monopoly Board argument that Did you listen to my recent interview with Preston Pysh?
No, I didn't catch it.
So he was talking about trying to explain inflation.
Right.
And he was saying there's two games of Monopoly that happen at the same time. But there's one new rule in that you can buy properties from the other board. So you can own property on the other board. And so what might happen is that the players at one table might collude and say, you know what, when we pass go, we're not going to give you $200. We're going to give you $600. And obviously your wealth increases and you've got more money than the other game. So then you can look at the other board and go, I'm going to start buying some of that property. And because things are becoming scarcer, the people around that table are like, what the fuck's going on here? Like, they're accumulating they're acquiring our property. And, we're feeling poorer. So they might collude and go, do you know what? When we pass go, we'll grant ourselves $1,000.
Exactly.
And they start buying back. And then you just have this tit for tat.
That's exactly what played out amongst the colonies.
Right.
Yeah. And that's exactly what the founders wanted to stop. by preventing the states from being in control of the money supply.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that was the second reason. Then the third was,
Which you can't do with gold and silver.
which you can't, right? You can't print more gold and silver. Exactly. You can't.
Yeah. So that's what they were trying to prevent.
Right. And then the third thing that the founders were trying to prevent was foreign entanglements, pissing off foreign countries who, want to do business in the States, and now they got to, transact in 50 different, well, at the time it was 13 different, currencies.
Right.
And keeping, foreign affairs within the realm of the federal government. So if you look at those purposes, right, gold and silver were the best money to solve those problems, right? Because like we were saying, you can't dig more gold out of the ground much faster. Certainly not then. So you had this concept of hard commodity monies. That's what gold and silver were. That's the original understanding of this. This is the only thing that fit that description, right? That solved all these ills at the time. You couldn't use tobacco, right? Because tobacco is not unforgeably costly. You can grow a lot more of it, and then it depletes. You use it; it's perishable.
Yeah.
And this is what like states did, right? They had commodity monies that were not gold and silver. They had tobacco notes. They actually had notes that were good for like a bale of tobacco back at the warehouse.
Huh.
Yeah, before independence. This is kind of how they got around not having specie, because they're on the other side of the world and nobody wanted to send their money over there, so they had to get creative. So commodity monies were what the colonists were using and what the early Americans were using, and gold and silver was the hardest commodity money. So now that's the original understanding. Now we have technological developments. We have synthetic commodity monies, right? This is what George Selgin describes Bitcoin as. And that is, Bitcoin is inscribing this hard money, monetary policy. It is the hardest. I mean, it's the hardest money we have now, right? I mean, the inflation. Besides, it's right on par with gold, inflation level wise, and it'll decrease past gold very shortly. Have the lowest inflation rate. So, if you look also at Satoshi's writings, right? And
his Federalist Papers.
That's his Federalist Papers. That's right. Some of the early, Bitcoin talk forums.
Yeah.
He describes it with, analogies to gold. Right.
Yeah.
That post about, imagine a, colorless, gray, metal that was, hard to produce, but people wanted it because you could send it wherever you wanted it to go. Right. Mm-hmm. And some of the early forerunners to gold, like Szabo's BitGold, they're all referring to gold. This is, Satoshi's, describing, the mining process and analogizing it to gold. So, now we have digital gold, we have Bitcoin, and it's just an extension of this commodity money concept that was the original meaning here in Article 1, Section 10.
So the interesting part of this is that even if the states can make gold and silver legal tender, because of technology and the way money works now, and it is essentially digital, it's kind of painful. It's kind of annoying. If a bank accepts gold, then they have to take custody of it, and then they have to sell it. And it's a painful thing.
Exactly.
It's kind of annoying. I can see why they wouldn't. But actually, they are a check and balance against the money printing. They reduce the power of the state, of the federal government. But Bitcoin's a different scenario. Bitcoin, because it's still digital and the way exchanges work, if a bank was to accept it, like they have to in El Salvador,
right,
there's an instant liquid market where they can come out of it and then hold the dollar. So if it was to be made legal tender, that would essentially achieve what I think the founding fathers would have wanted to, which is reduce the impact or the inflationary pressure that comes from printed money.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the argument for it to be included here is quite strong.
It is, yes, it is. I think it's fairly strong until you get to a strict textualist analysis.
anything.
Anything. And so the textualists say, original intent is fixed meaning to new technology, sure, but only when you have a broad language that's capable of encompassing that new technology. And so if you apply that here, going back to what I was saying, anything is the prohibition, right? That's the broad language. So you apply anything to any new technological money that comes along, because that's broad. And again, going back to commodity monies in the colonies, there were tons of different commodity monies, and tons of different monetary devices. So they knew that gold and silver wasn't the only thing, and that there would probably be some new way to a different commodity that you're going to new paper bills that come about, some new technology or scheme that would come about as money. So they that's the argument there. If you're looking at anything as being broad language that encompasses anything subsequent to the founding.
But the interesting part of this for me is that one of the things I romanticize about the founding fathers, which I know once you get into it, you learn about the different flaws of the different characters, what they would argue about, yada, yada. But there was this, for me, it felt like there was this general integrity that existed to restrict the power of the federal government to avoid tyranny, because you experienced that as people under our British king. Was it even referred to as the British king back then, or were we referred to the English king?
I think you were still Britons. Yeah.
Were we Britons?
I think it was British. The British Empire.
Yeah, British Empire. But ever since then, there's been obvious scope creep of what the federal government does, and there seems to be a lack of integrity since for those politicians, not all, but a lot of politicians, not to carry out their duties with the same integrity of protecting the constituents from a overreaching government. And it, for me, would feel like any interpretation of this, when it's to be debated or discussed, the starting point, it should be, should we interpret this in a way, or are we interpreting this in a way which does reduce that power? Are we able to achieve what the founding fathers wanted to achieve with this? So you can be literal and prevent Bitcoin, or you can be more pragmatic and understand that the introduction of Bitcoin into this does further what the founding fathers wanted to achieve.
Right. And you're exactly right that, there's a risk when you're talking about strict textualism that you become hyper literal.
Yeah.
And,
and tyrannical.
Yes. And in fact, if you look at the definitions, the contemporary definitions of gold at the founding, yes, it was a metallic substance, but it also was just defined as just money, right? So the meaning of gold in this clause is they're just referring to money, right? And we know a hard commodity money, but anything that's money. So you can find contemporary textual examples that do support a broader interpretation of gold and silver, and even broader interpretations of coin, right? Because that's another limiting word there, that it's got to be a gold and silver coin. But coins, coin was used like we use coin today very broadly. I'm going to coin a phrase. I'm going to coin paper money is how they used it. Benjamin Franklin talked about coining land in a land bank, almost like tokenizing assets like we think about today with digital assets.